All right. Well, my name is Bernadette Rule, and I want to begin by saying thank you to Nancy and Jeannie and Luke and everyone at Arts Dundas and at the Carnegie Gallery for including me in the lineup this year. I'm really honored to be part of it. My book that I've written is called Dark Fire. It's the story of two young tobacco-growing families who were massacred in the struggle to form a union of tobacco farmers in Kentucky, western Kentucky, in 1921. The centenary of their deaths was coming up. I had written this book 20 years ago, and I suddenly just felt that it was imperative that I get it out before June 25th, 26th, which was the night that they were killed. So I self-published the book, calling my press Ironing Board Press, because my mother used to let me sit at the ironing board when I was a kid and do my writing there. So this is an homage to my mother. I heard on CBC recently that the Belarus poet Valgina Moore, she was speaking and she said that she felt that the least we can do when something awful like this massacre happens, she's written about many of those in her country of Belarus, she said the least we can do is to remember. And the trouble with this massacre is that it has not been remembered. It silenced the community's sheer terrorism and fear for 100 years. So that, I think, was part of my determination to bring the book to the page. Now, the two families who were killed, two young fathers, Ernest Lawrence, who was in the Union, and Otis Drew, my father's first cousin, who was not in the Union. Their wives, who were sisters, Ola and Laura were sisters, they worked and lived side by side and were very close. And they were killed all together right after celebrating Laura's 21st birthday. Otis's little brother Delmer, who was 12, was also there and killed because he was out there helping to get the crop in. So I'll read you a passage. The first one is in the voice of my Uncle Pat, who was an enormous resource for me. He was 8 at the time that this happened, and he said to me, you have to go back to March of 1920 to start this story. That's when the night riders took over the town and burned the tobacco chute to the ground in order to try and control the market. My father, Pat, and all his family lived right across the street from the chute, and they witnessed this, which put them in a bit of a dangerous position as well. This is Pat. We'd gone to bed that Friday night expecting just to sleep the way you do. But when the kids was all fast asleep, Papa come into the front room where us kids was and rolled me out of bed, blanket and all, onto the straw matting that covered the floor. He was all in a hurry and said in a loud whisper, Bernard, Bridget, Ruth, y'all get down on the floor and lay still. They's carrying guns, and if they's to start shooting, them bullets will pass right through these walls. Lord, I never had come out of sleep straight into terror that way before, though it's happened to me a time or two since. The thing was, the room was being washed with waves of strange light that cast shadows across the walls and ceiling, and Mama was there too, a-laying on the floor, her long red hair all undone. Bridget Ruth scooted right up next to her, but me, I snaked on over to the window. Bernard asked Papa if it was night riders. Papa said, sure as hell is, hundreds of them. The next passage I'd like to read is one in which I attempted to imagine what it would be like to be married to a night rider. So this is from the perspective of Ernest Lawrence's wife, Ola. Ola was awakened one night in late May by a series of muffled thumps out in the dog trot. Her eyes flew open. It took her a moment to come awake and remember that Ernest was out. Someone was groping his way through the dark toward her. A fumbling at the door, and he entered the room. She lay still, her heart hammering. She thought of her shotgun up over the mantel, but there was absolutely no light in the room. Eventually the man cleared his throat, and Ola knew it was Ernest. Soft sounds told her he was clumsily stripping off his clothes and dropping them on the floor. Then he climbed in beside her and fell almost immediately to sleep, each snore lifting a faint incense of moonshine and tobacco. The next day, Ernest went about his work silently, his jaw set. He had no patience with the children, no teasing for Ola. In the early afternoon, as soon as she'd cleared up the dishes, she put Ralph in the buggy and set off to Laura's. Fred pulled Ethelyn in his wagon for a while and then ordered her out, saying she was too heavy. Ola let her sit on the end of the buggy facing her, where she dangled her legs down and sang, "Row, row, row your boat," over and over. The road was soft with recent rain, the pushing hard. By the time they got there, Ralph was asleep and Ethelyn drowsy. Laura was out on the porch with Mrs. January, James's widowed mother, who lived on the farm next to Laura's and Otis's. Laura's three were napping, and Ethelyn seemed happy enough to join them. Fred went off to play by himself among the outbuildings. "Watch out for that old well," Ola called after him. "Otis done boarded that over," said Laura. "I don't think he could fall down in it if he wanted to." "Well, he might just want to. You never know with boys," said Ola, and they all laughed. Mrs. January had been into Greenberry that morning and had a copy of the Daily Leaf on her lap. "Ola," she said, handing it to her, "you might want to read this piece right here." Ola read the headline she pointed to. "Masked Night Riders Visit McDermott Family. Whip. Order to leave." The next passage is from the perspective of Delmer, the 12-year-old younger brother of Otis, who was killed. And this is, he didn't want to go out and help with the crop. He wasn't fond of farming, so this is from his perspective. With the coming of the mild weather, farmers all over Wills County bolted coulters to their plows and laid off their tobacco fields in two directions. Midway through Delmer's first week in the country, the fields were dry enough to plant. The women and children dug deep into the plant beds, careful to pull the young tobacco seedlings out whole. They laid them into baskets as gently as if they were eggs and carried them into the fields. Though the Drew farm was only 25 acres to the Lawrences' 60, they grew the same amount of tobacco, 6 acres of it, the maximum one family could handle. Otis grew his in 3 enclosed fields behind his dark fire barn. Delmer preferred this to Ernest's one long 6-acre patch, which seemed endless as you started up each row. But at the north end, where the long fields stopped and the weeds began, the land sloped down to where the creek cut a bow shape inside a fringe of trees and vines. Beyond the creek was the bottomland where Ernest planted his hay and corn. The creek had been Delmer's favorite place to play when he was little, before his father died and his mother moved to town. You could enter it from under the bridge near the January place and walk inside its cool corridor of trees all the way around to the Lawrences. Further than that if you ever had time. Delmer remembered jumping from one orange gravel bar to the next, wading in the pooled water where arrows of light pointed down to the lazy crawfish traffic below. One time he'd found something like a crawfish edged across a rock in a gravel bar, but he'd put it in the pocket with the hole and lost it. The thought of the cool, shady creek helped him now as he followed Ola down the long rows. Carrying a basket of seedlings, she would drop one onto the mounded earth every 3 feet or so. He came behind with a tobacco poke and planted them, pushing their roots down into the cool dirt. Sometimes he and Ola would switch jobs for a while to give his back a rest, but mostly he worked the poke. The poke Delmer had been given was an old one, worn smooth with years of use. His father had whittled it from a curved ash stick so that it was slightly reminiscent of a pistol and fit his hand more comfortably than a straight peg. He relished this connection with his dead father, who'd grown steadily fainter and harder for Delmer to recall as the years passed. Now only a few images remained. His silence at one end of the dinner table, the way he sat leaning slightly forward on the wagon bench, as if he, and not the mule, provided the momentum. The swift, efficient motion of his arm as he reached for the razor strap when he needed to spank one of them. His dark eyes doing the smiling for his tobacco-chewing mouth as he waited out some long third Monday yarn. Otis had given Delmer a plug of tobacco to chew to help keep his mouth from drying out as he worked. When he had to spit out the juice, it made him feel like a man. At first, the rich smell of turned earth mingled with the taste of dark tobacco juice. These were joined in his head by the ecstatic droning of flies over mule droppings, and the cool, metallic smell of the creek at the end of the long field. But as the days wore on, Delmer felt heat and backache above all other sensations. In the evenings, he walked through the serpentine shadows the apple tree threw across the ground beside Otis's house and collapsed onto the front steps until supper was ready. At night, he dropped into bed beside Harry, like a stone, merely bearing the image of a boy. This next passage takes place on the last night of their lives. They went to go fishing, the men and boys went to go fishing for the dinner, for the birthday party for Laura. And this is an exchange between Ernest and Otis. And remember, it's Ernest who is in the Night Riders and is having stronger and stronger doubts about it. And he actually missed a meeting, which I believe is why they were killed. They were carrying the wash tub of fish between them, following their small sons, who struggled to share the burden of the dripping furled net. They walked on in silence for a while. Finally, Otis spoke up. "Ernest, what's eating you these days? You ain't yourself." "Well, hell, Otis," Ernest began painfully, surprised to be asked. "Monday's that chute-burning trial, and, well, things ain't looking so good." Otis was sorry he'd asked, because there wasn't a word he could say that wouldn't sound either condescending or confrontational. "Look, if it comes to you going to jail, I'll help Ola out all I can. You know that." Ernest felt an ache pass through him like the slow notes Hardin could draw on his bass fiddle. Here was naked proof of the character of Otis's friendship, the way he leaned not on their differences, as he might have, but on what bound them. Ernest didn't know how to go about explaining his worries, which weren't about being jailed himself. He looked down into the tub of dying fish. Finally, believing it would be improper to go into the business of the missed meeting of the Night Riders, he said simply, "I do know that, Otis." They walked on in a slightly lighter silence, Ernest determined to shake off his brooding no matter what it took. Beyond their boys, the old house stood surrounded by waving trees. Built 50 years before, it had been home to 2 large families prior to Ernest's and Ola's. Now it held their wives and children who were preparing for a party. As they approached the gate, Otis directed the boys to unroll the seine and drape it over the fence to dry. They did so. Then each one scampered off to tell his mother about the fine silver catch in the tub. Ernest smiled at the way Ola and Laura both whooped and carried on for the sake of their firstborn sons. Then Delmer came running up, his pockets full of green apples, and the party began. And of course, when the party ends, the Night Riders arrive. So this is the last part of the party. The south wind that had blown all day long was blowing still and felt good in the warmth of late June, even as midnight drew near. Cotton-headed with sleepiness, Delmer tried to listen as the adults became embroiled in a discussion about Dixie. "I don't care what anybody says," Ola was saying. "The Civil War changed everything, including Dixie. Can't be sung jaunty like no more, the way it was wrote. It's a lament now. Ought to be done slow, like you played My Old Kentucky Home for me that time, Ernest, remember?" Ernest had leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed. "Mm-hmm," he mumbled affirmatively. "Well, I think you're plumb crazy," said Laura. "Ain't nobody plays Dixie that way." Suddenly, Ernest sat up and pricked his ears. "What's the matter?" Otis asked. After a moment, Ernest said, "Nothing, I guess. I thought I heard a horse whinny down by the creek, but it must have carried down from the barn on this wind." "Well, I'm about ready to head on home," Laura said through a yawn. "Y'all, this was the best birthday party of my whole life. I couldn't never thank you enough." They gathered up the coffee cups and pie plates and took them inside. Then they went to fetch the children. Otis set a coal oil lamp on the table beside the door. All 11 were there, and Laura was tucking her presents into Madine's buggy when a bullet shattered the upper pane of the window over Ralph's crib, showering him with broken glass. Ola screamed and ran to get the baby, but several more shots were fired over their heads, and suddenly all the women and children were screaming. Ernest moved instinctively toward the guns over the mantel, understanding with instant and sickening certainty what he had suppressed when he heard the horse down by the creek a few moments before midnight. A shot through an upper pane. Night riders. Thank you, and I'd just like to say that the book, Darkfire, is available through James at the Printed Word here in Dundas. Thank you again.
That's great.